Good morning. Welcome to your, I think it's next panel of State of the Net. I'm Kelsey Griffiths. I'm a reporter covering telecom for Bloomberg News. I'm so happy to be here with a great panel to talk about the 30th anniversary of the 1996 Telecom Act. 3 decades ago, Congress envisioned that telecom providers would one day compete against another by offering multiple media services through their pipes. Today, that competitive vision has become a reality with the success of broadband internet. Although it's not necessarily the technology that regulators foresaw, it has changed our lives forever. Whether you access the internet through cable or fiber into the home, over a fixed 5G wireless connection, or even through satellite, it's become the communication method that we can't live without. But the 30-year-old Telecom Act was built on some structural assumptions that quickly became outdated. Now that the future is here, how can communications policy lay the groundwork and incentivize the next 30 years of change? That's what we're going to talk about today. I have some great panelists with me today. We have David Dawn of Comcast, Blair Levin of New Street Research, Chris Lewis of Public Knowledge, and Evan Swarstauber of Foundation for American Innovation. Since we're here to reminisce a little bit, I want to start off by talking about the 90s. Is anyone...
So we're not including Evan in this conversation?
You'll have to exclude both of us, but we're talking about the whole decade.
As well. They were just about different things.
Does anyone have some nostalgia for the 90s? What do you miss about the 90s, David?
The 90s, do I remember the, no, I'm kidding. So I think what I miss most, the sounds of the 90s, Nirvana, modems, fax machines,
Unforgettable.
all those beeping and burping that we don't hear anymore in our lives that we used to hear. You've Got Mail. Those are the sounds of the 90s that I think about.
You don't have to miss You've Got Mail. You can rewatch that now. I have recently. It's great.
It wasn't just a movie. Every time you got an email, it would say, "You got mail." Your computer would.
Wow, I really did show my age gap there. You're right.
Game Boy Color, Cartoon Network, Nickelodeon. That's how I spent most of my time, I think.
I was in high school. I don't think anyone misses high school. But the fashion is back. The blizzards are back. The blizzard of 96, I remember in high school. So the year of 96 is still with us.
That's right. Blair, what are you nostalgic for?
Actually, the last couple of weeks, I've been mostly nostalgic for my childhood in the 60s in Los Angeles, where the coldest weather was like low 50s. And I sometimes had to put on a long sleeve shirt. I'm very nostalgic for that. But it built character, so it was valuable. No, I mean, on a serious note, since I was actually involved in the 96 Act implementation, I would say there are two things that I'm nostalgic for. One is the policymaking process was much more serious. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. Mm-hmm. I went to a lot of meetings. Commissioner Ness was with us at the commission, and a number of people in this room were at that time. And there would be really serious debates about how to do these things. They were not tweets. They were not 140 characters. They were serious. And people didn't do it so that they could get on MS Now or Fox News. They did it because they were trying to build a policy. The second thing I miss is there was real optimism about what technology, and in particular communications technology, could do to improve the lives of average Americans. We can talk about whether it succeeded or not, but it was true then. I would say 100% of America was in favor of faster, better, cheaper communications for everyone. I think when I was doing the National Broadband Plan with a lot of other folks in 2009, 100% of America was in favor of making sure broadband was everywhere, affordable to everyone, and was utilized more effectively to deliver public services. I don't see that optimism today. And there are a lot of different reasons we can chat about for that. But that's a loss. It's a big loss.
Well, I think that's the perfect segue to get into the start of our discussion today, the real start of our discussion. I'd like to hear from all of you about what about the Telecom Act was ahead of its time, and on the flip side, what are some of those structural assumptions that law made that missed the mark? David, do you want to start?
Sure. So I view the Communications Act fundamentally as an antitrust act, right? It has duties to deal, it has market concentration regulation, right? We're talking about the national ownership cap. So it's fundamentally intended to promote competition. The Communications Act was intended to regulate monopolies, and the 96 Act was fundamentally intended to promote competition and try to lay the groundwork for a competitive environment, and one that we see today, intensely competitive. So in that respect, I think it was largely successful in that it promoted competition. We have more competition today than that could have been envisioned in 96, more than was probably envisioned, Blair, when you were doing the broadband plan. Consumers today have access to 4, 5, 6 broadband providers. So the promotion of competition and the realization that consumer welfare, what's best, is not the government micromanaging, setting tariff rates, but really to have the market do it when we have a competitive market. So I think that's the major innovation of the 96 Act. And in particular, when you look at it, there's something in Title II called Section 10. And Section 10 actually gives the FCC authority to rewrite or to refrain from implementing provisions of Congress. I think it's the only provision I'm aware of where an agency can ignore Congress's directive when the competitive market delivers for consumers. Because you realize that regulation actually can be harmful to consumers in a competitive market. So the Communications Act was fundamentally established to promote, the 96 Act, to promote competition. And Section 10 was deregulatory in that nature. And I think they got right. As to what they missed, well, they got it all wrong, actually, because they fundamentally thought that local phone companies were going to compete in the long distance space, and long distance companies were going to compete in the local space, and that's what was going to drive the consumer welfare. That Congress got completely wrong, and to be honest, it was cable that fundamentally got in that space and delivered broadband over its existing cable plan, which was a one-way video plan, and we were able to innovate and convert that to a two-way broadband plan, and able to do that very cost effectively. And so we invented the always-on internet, and that really changed society and everything we experience today. So they're not good at predicting the future, Congress primarily, and the FCC maybe, but the concept of competition as the greatest driver of consumer welfare, they absolutely got right.
I think some of the values certainly were ahead of their time, things that would be important in our space, duty to deal, competition, et cetera. It's interesting looking back how a lot of the fights we had about telecom policy over the past 3 decades have been about this concern that the broadband layer of the stack could become a bottleneck to innovation, become a bottleneck to starting a business. I think, and for a lot of the reasons David said, competition has largely solved that problem. But at the same time as that debate was happening, the software layer became the bottleneck. The software layer is where we saw a massive reduction in competition, in my view. If you want to start a mobile app today, you are dealing with a duopoly that is 99% of every American smartphone, Apple or Google. They can decide unilaterally to just, you can't start your business because we don't believe your cybersecurity standards are up to ours. The browser market, people have a lot of concerns about that being a bottleneck to innovation with AI. Access to AI compute, right? If you want to be a software or a startup, it's very expensive. So I think some of those values were certainly ahead of their time. And I don't fault the lawmakers at the time. It was obviously 1996. What Congress has failed to do is apply those values to other sectors or other layers of the internet stack. And it's interesting that the only internet law we have doesn't mention the internet and only deals with antitrust issues at the infrastructure layer.
I'll start with what they really did well, they got right. Section 230, bringing in an era of democratized speech, for good or for ill, because there's some awful stuff on the internet. But it made it easier for the average person to build community, to say what they like because of the protections of that third-party speech on platforms. And I think it's actually something they got right and something we need to maintain, that balance of not having high barriers of entry to actually publish and put your thoughts and your information out there. I agree with the focus on competition, but I think David and Evan's answers show that we thought about competition differently back then than was a reality in the marketplace. David's point about cable stepping up instead of local versus long distance. And when I came to tech policy, they were basically trying to get cable and telecom to compete against each other because most people only have access to one high-speed broadband provider, if they're lucky, 2, and if it's 2, it's the cable and the telco provider in their town. There is competition among different ways of delivering broadband. So you have mobile and now we have satellite, but they offer different services. And so is it perfect competition? No. And you see it in the choices consumers make. Low-income consumers are fast to sign up for mobile because they can take it with them everywhere. And then if they can't fit into their budget, they don't get a home account. This is why we had low-income subsidies to support getting home accounts so people could actually not do their homework on their phone, but do their homework on a real computer, just to give an example. The high cost of satellite broadband is prohibitive for some folks. There's data limits on mobile. So it's not perfect competition, but we are seeing a wide variety of ways of delivering broadband, and that's exciting. One more thing I'll mention, because of the focus on competition, I would argue that we took for granted in the 90s the basic core public interest values that the FCC protected because they had always worked for a generation or more. Things like private communications and privacy generally on the network. Things like the reliability of the network. Things like local networks connecting into making one global network. And now that the FCC is basically letting authority move away for broadband at the agency because we haven't had an update of the act and we haven't had Title II authority over broadband, those protections beyond competition are at risk. And we have to shore them up. Interconnection and competition, privacy, reliability, 911. You can go down the list of things that you get out of utility regulation.
So I don't want to take up the next hour, so I'm going to try to do this really quickly. Let me just mention a few things. One thing that it got right, but the courts got wrong, Communications Decency Act, the court threw it out. It did actually mention the internet, but only in 230, and it was very limited. But the reason I say that is that took away from the government the ability to regulate speech, which was harmful. And it's a very debatable point. But right now in Los Angeles, there's a huge case going on about the damages that Facebook Meta has done to young people. And my point being, you essentially said we're going to have private law firms try to remedy the harm as opposed to the government. I think it was a huge mistake. Another thing it got right, a small thing in a way, but turns out to be a really big thing, wireless number portability. Without that, and people talk about the 96 Act, we had a big strategy. It wasn't just about the Act. It was about the spectrum auctions. It was also about the WTO agreement. It was trying to do a number of different things. But the wireless number portability, which Tom Wheeler, who was the leading lobbyist, tried to get us to essentially not do it. And he has confessed to me that was the worst lobbying he's done, for which we've forgiven him because that was his job. But there were other things. I would say perhaps the two most important things we did, which were kind of part of the Act and partly not, was we drew down the terminating access charges for wireless and for data. And the reason that was significant is that in wireless only started to go up when we said it's not going to be 15 cents a minute, which is what, if my memory is correct, the local exchange carriers were charging to terminate a call from a wireless phone because all calls were being terminated on local phones in those days. That's when AT&T started the one rate, and wireless in combination with a lot of new competition because of the auctions started to really rise. But the second one was the data one. The local exchange carriers wanted to charge a big amount for data. And if you had done that, two things would have happened. Number one, the transmission companies would have owned the internet in the same way that the cable industry in the 80s owned cable content. Mm-hmm. And you would not have gotten anything like the innovation. You certainly wouldn't have had Zoom. You wouldn't have had voice over internet protocol. There would have been a bazillion things you wouldn't have. And so those were, and when you look at the market, which is what I spend most of my time doing these days, what you see, of course, is that there are, in 1996, there was only one network company in the top 10 of market caps, and that was AT&T. When you look at the top 10 today, 7 of them are dependent on fast, cheap communications, but none of them are in the network business. And that is a huge shift in value that was only done because of what we did on terminating access charges. And I will only add that I think the single biggest pro-competitive thing the Congress did was not conscious. That is to say, it was the program access rules of the 1992 Cable Act. David in the cable industry always disagrees with me on this, but they said they got into broadband because they were visionary and thoughtful, and there's some truth to that. But the real truth is, in my opinion, that by forcing the cable industry to sell its programming in non-discriminatory terms to the satellite industry, cable understood that satellite had a lower cost structure and a better regulatory regime, and in 10 years, satellite would completely dominate multi-channel video, and so cable needed to use its network to have another service. They did it brilliantly, and the always-on internet was credited to the cable industry. The other thing that happened is that the phone companies went from being dial-up, which was a really shitty service, to DSL. Now, here's the interesting point. DSL was invented in the 1980s. When Netscape was invented, why didn't the telcos just come out immediately and start offering DSL, which is a much better service and cheaper? Well, the answer is in the second. Because it's cheaper, the phone companies didn't want to do that. They wanted to sell you 2 lines. And so it was competition that drove them to, well, it wasn't about the technology, it was about the state of the competitive market. So that's an example, and I could cite to some other ones that really drove certain kinds of competition.
Wonderful. Well, I want to drill into something that Chris mentioned, and I think you just alluded to it as well, Blair. 30 years later, we talk a lot about convergence, where internet networks are now being bundled, internet providers are bundling home internet with mobile internet. And I think we're hearing a lot of talk around convergence. So I'm curious if you think convergence is real and if it's here to stay.
I think the market reflects it. You have cable competing in the mobile wireless market. You have mobile wireless competing in home broadband. You have satellite starting out with low Earth orbit as mostly focused on rural, but we're increasingly seeing conversations about direct to device, which suggests that they may be interested in competing in the direct consumer mobile broadband market. I think there's ferocious competition in broadband, not for every single consumer in the country, but for large swaths of the country. You're seeing fiber, non-government funded fiber overbuilding. In some places, 1, 2 providers saying we can make a viable business out of, even if there's already a cable and a fiber provider there can be a third one. So I do think there is a lot of convergence, and that raises the question of, does the way that this law envisions the market still make sense? I think one key area to look at is universal service. Universal service is based on the idea that you're going to have a monopoly provider in an area, you're going to subsidize their operating expenses in perpetuity, and that one provider is just going to be there and there's not going to be any competition. In an era when you can grab a Starlink Mini from Best Buy, does that make sense? Does it make sense to continue subsidizing companies instead of the end consumer? If there are options, and if we believe that demand can drive deployment and availability of fixed wireless, satellite, fiber, et cetera, should we instead just deal with the consumer's income challenges as opposed to subsidizing a company in the hopes that they offer their service affordably without knowing if any consumer actually wants it? I'm glad Chris mentioned the cost of a satellite dish as being expensive, because I think satellite's a great example of how our conversations in DC are sometimes backwards. There are arguments against satellite being part of a rural broadband solution because of the upfront cost of a dish is $300 to $500. Yet the answer to that in some cases is, let's spend $50,000 running fiber to that house. I have 2 questions. If you offered the person living in that house 10 grand or 50,000 to the company, which do you think the person would take, right? Number one. And number 2, if the cost of the dish is so expensive, okay, how about we buy the dish, government money, and then pay for their service for 10 years? That would be cheaper than running the fiber line. So I think it just shows how the act informs how these conversations take place. And we're so boxed in sometimes to this idea that we have to fund the deployment, we have to fund the company to deploy the service, and then hopefully people subscribe. But I think in this era of convergence, we need to think differently. And to me, the idea that satellite is too expensive, so let's run fiber for 50 grand to that house, just shows how backwards we are. We need to rethink that conversation.
So Blair, I'd actually like to hear from you on this, since you are looking at the market and how they're responding. I think we're hearing that a lot from the companies these days, that convergence is driving their profits and the way that they're marketing. Do you think that this is something that consumers are really looking for? And is this play where you're getting multiple types of internet from the same company something we're going to continue to see more of?
So Wall Street and DC think about this differently. Wall Street thinks about convergence in terms of the question, does T-Mobile have to buy Charter? Which is to say, do the wireless guys have to buy wires to have a long-term business? And Wall Street has shifted 3 years ago. The T-Mobile Charter question was the one I probably got most often. Nowadays, T-Mobile is saying, no, we don't need it. We can essentially do everything from a wireless perspective. AT&T and Verizon are mixed on this. A lot has to do with churn and all that. There's no doubt, though, that fundamentally there's convergence from a 1996 perspective. What we were thinking about is what does it mean when everything goes digital? And this was actually not in the act, but it was very much on the part of the thinking of the companies and our own thinking, which is once everything goes digital, what's the difference between voice, video, and data? They're all data. And so in that sense, we are absolutely, in kind of a consumer perspective, there is convergence. But again, from a Wall Street perspective, it's not quite clear what is going to happen. I will just say T-Mobile is by far the best performing communication stock in the last 5 years. The two big cable companies, I'm sorry, David.
Not as sorry as I am.
That is no doubt true performing, which tells you something about the way Wall Street's looking at it.
David, would you like to respond?
Sure. Consumers clearly want what they really want is connectivity everywhere.
Right.
They have different applications. So when they're home, they're using 4K TVs. They're using things that are data intensive and require the kind of networks the cable industry and the telcos have been building with fiber, right? And then when they're out mobile, they want something that works on a mobile device. Now on an airplane, you want connectivity. Apparently when you're climbing a mountain, you want connectivity. So everyone's gonna want connectivity everywhere, if that's what you mean by convergence, absolutely. Bringing it back to this topic though, we have a Communications Act which is anti-convergence. It's siloed, right? It's got different regulations. AT&T accesses the rights of ways differently than we access the rights of ways. Rights to content are different and our obligations are different, as Blair noted. So you still have these vestiges which are completely misaligned with how the market is operating today. So that really needs to be addressed.
Chris, any thoughts there?
I'll just add in, I guess I agree with David. Yeah, customers do want connectivity. I don't think customers think about every day in their daily lives, oh, the market's converging and what am I going to do about it? That's a Wall Street thing.
That is,
And they should be concerned about it. So I think they're worried about connectivity. And I think that actually makes concepts like universal service more important. Universal service was, as a principle, comes out of not the 96 Act, comes out of the 34 Act, and the lead up to it, the idea that we had a monopoly, and because they're a monopoly, we would require them to serve everyone. And then in the era of competition, we flipped it and we said, okay, we will look at some deregulation because we're promoting competition here, but what are the things that we still need to connect everyone? It's the principle, and then you get the fund. And so the point of the fund is to make sure that we are connecting everyone, and that's what consumers want. It's high cost fund is about making sure that where there is not a business case, that there's a subsidy to get people broadband. Same with the affordability and the schools and libraries fund, you can go down the line.
Well, you were doing a great job of teeing me up for my next questions. We're really on the same brainwave here. So I wanted to then turn to talking about universal service next. Obviously, the 96 Act helped to conceive of some solutions for fixing this problem, which is how do we make sure that everyone is able to afford to be connected? Not only the end users, but also the service providers that need to reach some of these areas that are maybe don't have a business case for building out to. However, we all know that this system has become increasingly imbalanced. What are the prospects looking like to reform the way that Universal Service Fund works so that all Americans can stay connected? Anyone want to take a first swing at that?
I'll just add an interesting historical moment 30 years ago, yesterday, when the president signed the 96 Act. All Newt Gingrich, the Speaker of the House, talked about was the E-rate. And in fact, both Gore and Clinton did the same, connecting all the classrooms. The irony to me was that it was not in the House version of the bill, and it only passed by one vote in the Senate version, and yet that was the thing that the politicians understood instinctually was the most popular thing, but whatever. And I do think that that point that Chris is making, I would say it goes back to 1912 Kingsbury commitment,
Yes.
but whatever, that's a big issue. And when I left the FCC the first time in 97, I thought if the contribution factor ever went to 10%, there would be a revolt and universal service would be changed. It's now at about 40%. I don't know why Wall Street pays me to make predictions, but they do, because I certainly got that one wrong. I certainly would have predicted that Chairman Pai would have addressed it, which he did as he was walking out the door. Rosenworcel did nothing on it. And as far as I can tell, Carr's doesn't want to do anything about it either. It is a curious thing. It obviously needs reform. What's going to happen is that Trump and Secretary Ludnick, if he still has a job, will declare mission accomplished when the BEAD program is effectively done. But it's not, because there are digital divides. There are digital divides in cities. There are digital divides in adoption because of affordability. There are digital divides in utilization. There's a lot of them. And I don't know, particularly, there is no thought about what does universal service mean in an era of AI. I don't know the answer to that. But what I do know is that government does better, and this is what we try to do with the National Broadband Plan, when it actually asks questions and asks a lot of people and has a process designed to get that answer. But Right now, no one in the government is asking that question. So it is highly unlikely, this time I'm predicting again, that we're going to get the right answer, because if you don't ask the question, you don't get the answer.
I'll add, I'm negative on the prospects too. We're not getting people asking the right questions, like Blair said. The folks who have started to ask questions, like the bipartisan bicameral USF working group, we haven't seen anything out of them since they collected comments at the end of the summer last year. And we're rapidly approaching election season when Congress starts to do less. So the window is closing for them to take action.
It is hard to do less than what Congress did last year. But they will succeed.
Yeah. Blair's also right. Republican, Democrat, Republican FCC chairpersons have been leaving it to Congress to fix. We've tried to make arguments to them that they could do some things, and they've tried to defer to Congress. And yet there's talk of the current FCC potentially harming the contribution factor by pulling back subscriber line fees that are going to get a large chunk of the contribution factor. They're getting out in front of the reforms that we want Congress to enact. Mission accomplished from BEAD, as much as we believe in BEAD as a program, is really problematic because BEAD and the Digital Equity Act, which was illegally impounded by the president, are also in the ACP, which Congress let run out. All of that was about a short-term fix to the actual drivers of the digital divide. And we need USF to address the long-term sustainable fix, whether it's affordability, whether it's deployment, whether it's adoption. And adoption in digital literacy takes a lot of things and a lot of work. And the fact that the president just claimed that a law is illegal and he did not enact it, a law that was passed by Congress and signed by the president he is ignoring, is really problematic. And there's a whole community of people who do this work, who are counting on those funds to help Americans in every small town get connected to broadband. I'm wearing a t-shirt from the conference because digital inclusion is a lot of things. It's not just digital skills, it's not just affordability, it's devices, it's accessibility, it's a lot of different things.
In order to get reform done, there are some entrenched camps that will need to meet somewhere in the middle. I think there's a camp in Congress that wants to just outright abolish the whole thing. There's another camp that is okay with it existing, but it has to be a direct appropriation from Congress. And then there's a camp that has good reason to not trust the congressional appropriations process, because if you're worried about instability, the short-lived ACP, Affordable Connectivity Program, kind of made your case, right? Because there's this old adage, right? Every entitlement stays forever. That was one that did not. So if you're worried about Congress being fickle with appropriations, you can always point to ACP and say, well, that's why we need this, basically this toll booth arrangement situation for USF. I think obviously the contribution mechanism is really backwards, right? We're assessing a dying service in landline telephones in order to fund an advanced service in broadband. I already made my point about maybe we shouldn't just be picking one company and saying you get a monopoly and then we'll just fund you forever. But I also think we need to think about the funding. If USF is going to continue, and if we decide that it's not going to be a direct appropriation, I think the obvious place to look is the companies that are spending hundreds of billions of dollars on data centers every year. It is not a punishment. USF has acted as an indirect subsidy to technology companies for years, right? We fund, whether it's low-income consumers through Lifeline, whether it's the schools through E-Rate, whether it's the high-cost fund. What do people do when they get internet? They use services from an increasingly small group of companies that control business software, email, streaming, et cetera. So we have, as ratepayers, been subsidizing the growth of these companies for many years. I think it is not unreasonable to ask them to contribute what would be a rounding error in any sort of quarterly earnings to this program. And I do not buy the idea, and there's plenty of studies that have been funded in this city that say if we dare to put a tiny fee on cloud computing, companies will stop investing and we'll lose the race to AI. I'm exaggerating, but that's basically what it said. I don't think that AI companies will just stop investing in AI if they have to kick a little bit to the connecting of low income and rural Americans. I think it's basic corporate responsibility at this point. I don't think it's unreasonable, and I think that has to be part of any sort of solution to this issue.
David, do you?
Just quickly, the concept of universal service predates even the Communications Act. For 100 years, we've had a policy in this country of bringing networks everywhere. And that policy has evolved to helping people with connectivity challenges, Lifeline and the Communication and the Telecom Act, and then of course ACP more recently. So we know you can't just build it, they won't always come. So we do have these principles of connectivity everywhere and helping people get on. The current mechanism is outdated. It's based on a monopoly system. The taxation mechanism or fee mechanism, for those lawyers in the room, is based on an outdated model that there was one provider, and that clearly doesn't work anymore, right? I mean, the one thing we all will agree on is we have a more competitive environment here and our regulations need to evolve. Let me give one concrete example, though, that I think is amazing. When you look at the BEAD program, okay, we're going to give anywhere from 20 and in the end $40 billion to bring broadband everywhere in this country, right? And it's going to be incredible, and we're going to actually, I think, come very close to accomplishing it. And it's a big accomplishment. And we're going to do it in record time before the end of the decade, probably. One of the things, I was at a conference last year, and you have to demonstrate the sustainability plan of your proposal when you apply for funds. And I was on a panel with Western state broadband officers, and all 4 of them said, every sustainability application, every application going to be their sustainability portion contemplated USF grants on top of BEAD. So now we're going to give $40 billion to build the networks, and then some of these companies out west in particular are expecting the government to continue to fund their operating expenses on top of this $40 billion. So if you want to pick one thing, I would say no to that and say if you can't come up with a plan that is self-sustaining after you get the equivalent of millions and billions of dollars, then you shouldn't be funded. And maybe that means in some areas it has to be satellite, I don't know. But clearly, we cannot be funding all of your CapEx and then all of your OpEx going forward through universal service, and fundamentally by taxing mostly the elderly who are still subscribing to voice phone service. So I would recommend that specific no right now, so this thing doesn't keep growing and getting out of hand.
But Kelsey, connect the thread to what Blair said when we started.
Sure.
When in the 90s, when he was an adult and I was in high school. No, but this is why we need Blair, because of his wisdom and his experience. Congress used to do hard things back then.
Yeah.
The 96 Act wasn't easy.
Yeah.
It was a compromise. And the problems that I agree with some things David said, I disagree with others, but at some point, the people that we elect need to take accountability and do the work to do the hard things. And in the meantime, it's been 4 years since the ACP went under. That's a whole high school time for someone who was low income and didn't have connectivity. That's $14 billion and counting that the consumers had not had coming into their households because of a lack of political will and ability to do hard things.
And can I just add one thing I should have said about it? What Congress got right was it had an expert agency that could adjust and do studies and deal with things. Whether it's being an expert agency now or has been in a while, I don't know, or we could chat about it. But I think as we particularly look to a future which is dominated by AI, one of the big questions is what's the agency that addresses the problems that creates and protects the public interest, while at the same time trying to make sure that AI does benefit the public in ways that it certainly will, but there's a downside risk as well.
That's what I want to talk about next. Artificial intelligence is obviously already changing the way that we use networks, driving up demand for bandwidth and processing power. It's also changing the way that networks themselves can respond to demand in real time. So I'd love to hear from you all on how you think AI is going to influence the way we think about and regulate networks over the next 30 years, and particularly what are the regulation trends, either national or state, that we should be paying attention to now?
Go ahead.
Let's start with the trend that the states are actually acting to try to protect people for technology that they're totally fascinated and curious about and scared of at the same time. And so you may not like the regulations that they're enacting, you may like them, but they actually have had the political will to do something. And the feds need to take notice that the states are eating their lunch on trying to get something done right. It'd be great if we had a digital regulator for digital platforms, including artificial intelligence. It doesn't have to be the FCC. The FCC has an expertise in communications networks. There are specific public interest values that go with that. But with AI, there's environmental and power and water concerns. There is a huge privacy and data concern that Congress has whiffed on. There's the concerns of free speech and disinformation. The courts are leading the charge on addressing IP and copyright issues, and I think striking a balance that is actually smart. So the feds need to take notice of states trying to meet the need. With fewer resources, they have to balance their budgets. They can't run deficits. Imagine if we made a huge push to have the sort of flexible regulator that Blair was describing for the digital platform space and AI. That would be phenomenal.
To keep it somewhat tethered to telecom before I move away from that topic because you said AI. I mean, one potential huge benefit for connectivity is just the fact that these data centers need fiber, right? And if these companies are spending this amount of money to build fiber all over the country, that could end up being a huge benefit for consumers if those companies end up striking deals with residential and consumer broadband companies. We'll see how that plays out. Or if they end up just reserving the fiber for data centers, maybe then consumers don't end up benefiting as much on the retail broadband level. That could end up being a huge benefit. In terms of the regulatory issues, I think getting back to one of my earlier points of just the issues that were contemplated in the act, I think are going to be major issues that apply to AI going forward: neutrality, antitrust concerns. I think right now, this market looks very competitive. Companies are spending a lot of money. Startups are not being denied computing power as long as they can access the funding either from a larger tech company or from venture capital. That all looks great. If history is our guide, these companies all become anti-competitive over time, whether it's in search, ad tech, app stores, et cetera. So I think some of the principles of the Telecom Act may need to be applied in legislation or through enforcement actions to AI. And we don't want a situation where once you develop, there's 3 or 4 companies maybe that kind of corner this market, then people who want to build on top of these AI platforms can't get access. It's concerning to me that there are companies that don't want to sell chips to American companies, but would rather sell them to China, right? And are they doing that just because they love China so much, or because they view that American company that wants to buy chips as a competitor, and they're using international markets to try to suppress domestic competition? That's something I think that needs to be looked at in the AI market. So yeah, those principles of the act should be guiding the AI conversation going forward.
Obviously, we believe AI is going to drive a tremendous amount of demand for our services, so that's a good thing. We're building multi-gigabit networks that are going to be able to deal with all the bandwidth-intensive applications of AI. Some of it is bandwidth-intensive, some of it isn't, but we're going to make sure the consumer has whatever it wants. What is interesting, it's nice to see the tech companies finally investing in network facilities, data centers, because they spent over a decade trying to pass those costs on to consumers and network operators. Everyone's familiar with those debates. So it's good to see them investing and not looking for data center neutrality or posing those costs on other people. But what also is interesting is we know where this is going to go. Like, we had number portability, you said, was a seminal concept. Are we going to get data portability? Am I going to be able to take all of my chat searches and move it to Gemini if I want to subscribe to that one? So and that's exactly what we've been doing in the Communications Act for decades, is trying to figure out where consumers have barriers to switching. And we're going to see those develop here as they become more dominant. They're going to build more barriers, make it harder on consumers to leave, then of course jack up prices. And so there will be a role for competitive actors, and I don't know if it'll be or competitive players. I don't know if it's the FCC or the DOJ or the FTC, but we're going to need things to protect consumers like we've had in our space for the better part of a century.
Can I just, a couple of things I'd add to that, I think those are all very valuable suggestions. Number one, how many people here have seen the recent Anthropic ads attacking OpenAI? If you haven't, you absolutely should watch them. They're brilliantly done. The question I don't know the answer to is whether it only hurts OpenAI or it causes everyone to be skeptical of AI overall. It's attacking OpenAI for having advertising. And I won't tell you how they do it, but it's quite brilliant. But it raises the question of, will market forces force a certain kind of behavior, or do we need government to have transparency? So if you're talking to a chatbot and the chatbot suggests a certain thing, do they have to reveal that that's a sponsored thing? So that would be one. And similarly, we haven't talked about agentic AI, which I think will be very powerful, but also very problematic. Are we going to apply fiduciary duties to that agent, or are we going to allow the agentic AI to essentially recommend the hotel which is sponsoring the service? So there's a bunch of questions that relate to that. But I would go back to, again, I think as was said in Animal House, being dumb and stupid is no way to go through life. Well, right now the government is dumb and stupid as to AI, and it's deliberately so. I mean, and I think that's the wrong way to do this. You actually need an expert agency. And whether it's the FCC transitioning to it, or the FTC, or a new agency, Harold Felt, there you are. I think you wrote this like
2019.
6 years ago.
2019.
Yeah. Just read Harold Feith. Let's just do exactly what he wants, and the world would be a better place.
I can endorse that.
Yeah.
Well,
So do
we've
I.
talked a lot today about the broadband and data side of the 96 Act, and I think AI falls under that pretty squarely. But we know that the 96 Act also touches on competition in the media sector, potentially objectionable content online, and also the public interest. So they're going to play us off here in 5 minutes, but I think I would like to hear from each of you in sort of a lightning round about whether the media environment has outgrown some of these regulations and what principles are still relevant today.
I'll be very quick. I think obviously, yes. If you combined every single broadcaster in the country into one company, it would have 20% of TV viewing, right? That is below cable and less than almost half of what streaming has now. So I think the media market has just shifted so drastically that a lot of the regulations and assumptions of this law are woefully outdated. You're looking at Netflix, 90 billion potential merger of Warner Brothers. That's like the largest broadcasters, like a fraction of that, right? Cable is even a fraction of that now. So in terms of viewing, so I think, yeah, the market has long outpaced these rules.
Okay, let's not combine every local broadcaster into one company, please. There's a principle of localism that we need to recapture. It's true.
I was not suggesting that.
Okay.
It was a illustration of market share.
Well, I mean, let's watch what's happening in the market right now. The commissioner was just up here talking about the current one. But there is a value of localism that takes a regulator probably to enforce because we see what market forces are generating. And it's also true about the importance of localism when it comes to journalism as a public good and hits that journalism has taken with the change in the ad marketplace and so forth. So I already gave my screed on 230 and content and the importance of it, but it doesn't mean there aren't counterbalance impacts that we need to reckon with.
So I want to, first of all, the market has really changed. The FCC should evaluate that. But Kelsey, I'm going to throw a question back to you. Not that you have to answer it now, but you have to get us the answer. Last February, after the commission meeting, Brendan Carr said, I think it was in response to you, but I could be wrong about that. If anyone doesn't understand what I mean by the public interest, I will have a proceeding on it. Would you tell him, I do not understand what he means, and would he please have a proceeding? Because what I understand him to mean is, if you're a conservative entity, it's whatever you want is in the public interest. And if you're not, it isn't. That's the way we on Wall Street are interpreting it. Disney and Comcast can't do deals, Nexstar and Tegna can't, right? That's pretty clear. So please ask him that question when he's going to start the proceeding.
Thank you for the homework, Blair. I'll see what I can get you. Any closing thoughts, David?
Yeah, I'm going to invoke the privilege where you don't answer the question the moderator asked and change it. I mean, we could talk about media. It's an issue of values. It's an issue of technology. It's an issue of nostalgia. Like, we all wish we sat around and listened to the local news, but we just aren't. And localism is a great idea, but fundamentally it isn't what people are valuing right now. And the market reflects that, and our regulations probably should. Right.
No, this is why you need regulation, because the market doesn't reflect what the people want. I'm sorry, I worked in local government. I really value my local newspaper and the coverage of the school board that I was on so that parents knew what we were voting on. I really value the reporters that we just lost at the Washington Post, my hometown paper, that covered my sports in high school or the elections. Yeah, so
we're all nostalgic for the old.
That's not nostalgia. That's a public need.
Are you saying the government should regulate the Washington Post?
No.
Staffing?
I'm saying that there are things that we can do to help support journalism as a public good.
That's separate, right?
And
I'm not sure that's the communication.
And that is a public interest value.
I'm not sure that's the Communications Act, though.
Yeah, look, this is an ongoing debate, and there was the newspaper cross-ownership ban.
Evan is the peacemaker?
Yeah.
Wow.
Thanks, buddy.
We've Chris. Conversation really went south, Chris. I'm
Chris.
sorry. I didn't mean that.
Chris, I hear what you're saying, but we loved newspapers so much. We had this newspaper cross-ownership ban for years that prevented radio and TV companies from buying them, and we loved them so much we strangled them to death. And I blame a lot of that on Google monopolizing the ad market.
Yes.
But we did not help the situation by preventing potential buyers from investing in those properties. And if you look at radio and TV today, the trend lines are very discouraging. So basically, we can say, let's deregulate so that there can be some investment and some combinations that make sense. Or the alternative is we maintain these regulations and then get the American people on board with subsidizing the news, which in this political environment, I don't know that it makes sense to have media companies dependent on the government to then report accurately on that government that is subsidizing those media outlets. Like, I don't think we are in a political environment where that can be feasible.
Evan, can I just say, you were 5 at the time, so you were forgiven for not remembering that Reed Hundt tried to get rid of the newspaper broadcast ownership rules and was opposed by a bunch of conservatives in Congress.
That's fair.
Blair.
And then if
No, it was Michael Powell who told the Democrats, "You're going to love your newspapers to death."
Oh, no, I agree. But I'm just saying in 95, I think it was the Cap Cities deal.
Right.
There were some newspapers we wanted to say, well, let's get, that was put in by Nixon to punish the Washington Post. History is weird.
Kelsey, I know you're going to wrap up, but I was avoiding the whole panel. Blair saying I was 5 at the time.
Yeah.
That's just a mic drop. That's
Can I
not
do
fair.
one thing? I want to revisit my first question when you said, "What am I nostalgic for?" And this panel reminded me bipartisanship.
Perfect place to
Give it
leave it.
up.
Thank you, David. And if, in case anyone was wondering, I am nostalgic about cereal box prizes from the 90s. What happened
Hey.
to those? Thank you all. Fantastic panel. Really appreciate it.
Let's start with you. Thank you.